All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is really exciting. We have never done a project like this before. It was quite an honor and a collaborative effort. We did do four, well, this is the fourth. So this is our fourth in a series of four for 2021. And at the end, one of the questions we'll be asking is what would be helpful for next year. So as we go through, if you have ideas, think about that. So today it is my honor. Their presenters will be Tom Allgaier from New York State Department of Ag and Markets, and myself, Meg Wilkinson, as well as Mitch O'Neill from the New York Natural Heritage Program. Some of you may have heard of the New York Natural Heritage Program, and some of you may have heard of IMAP as well. So IMAP team and the IMAP database are operated for New York out of the New York Natural Heritage Program. The Heritage Program works on rare species issues and many very cool modeling projects and several other awesome projects. And we have a new website. If you haven't seen it, it went live, I don't know, maybe almost a year ago now, but nynhp.org. And from that page, you can also click to the iMapInvasives.org page, where you'll see IMAP is best known probably for submitting data, but we also we work on the Watercraft Inspection Program database, and we have some very nice spatial prioritization models that might be of interest to many people, and lots of other resources on our webpage. Today, we're going to focus on spotted lanternfly, tree of heaven, and IMAP. We will share a little bit of a progress update for the grid square stats as of now. And as I mentioned, also frame out what would be good goals for next year. And we'll end with a Q&A section. And as I mentioned in that bottom corner, you should have the ability to submit a Q&A question for one of the presenters. It's similar to a chat box, it's just a different box. So we are super fortunate in New York to have really quite a collection of individuals and organizations and agencies and academics and all working on invasive species issues. So different groups, volunteers, citizen scientists, natural resource professionals, they contribute data to IMAP, they review data that's submitted, which is super helpful because we get lots of data. And people utilize IMAP data in many ways now. There's many ways to leverage that data for custom in-house use in your own agency or organization. Today, we're going to focus on invasive plants, the tree of heaven, and one invasive animal, insect, the spotted lanternfly. Thank you. Yep, next. Okay. All right, so spotted lanternfly, people, Tom will cover. This is a big deal, this one, as some of you are probably already aware. And it is a coordinated statewide effort led by Ag and Markets. They are involving volunteers as well as invasive species state partners. And we're here today because we're also involving you. So if you click again, it'll say you. There we go. So today we're hoping everyone on this call will feel comfortable by the end to contribute data. You will hear us repeat many, many times to please include a photo with your data. That's most helpful for the confirming network. And I do want to emphasize that the spotted lanternfly data is special. So that data is reviewed by New York State agency staff. Other IMAP data, the tree of heaven records, and if you submit purple loosestrife or hemlock woolly adelgid, we have an extensive IMAP volunteer confirmers network that includes agency staff in some places, but also master gardeners and others. So That is a wonderful network and very helpful, but the spotted lanternfly data is exclusively reviewed by the New York State agency staff. Okay, so today, if you haven't done the poll, please do the poll because we'll share those results here live. This is a team effort to help protect our valuable resources of New York, agricultural, natural, and recreational, and more. So today's objectives, we hope that everyone attending will be comfortable by the end of this presentation to identify spotted lanternfly, identify tree of heaven, learn about iMapInvasives, and know how to set up the, know where to find out how to set up the app. I don't actually know, Mitch, if you're covering the app or not on this particular one, but we have 4 wonderful short videos online if we don't cover it here today. And then we will cover how to select a square and make sure that everyone is ready to go outside and survey within the square they have selected. All right, poll results. Okay, so they popped up. Does everyone see that?
Everyone should see that.
Okay, so on the how comfortable, the middle of the road is the center of that particular one. So moderately comfortable made the highest, that except one, and then 34% that didn't respond. But of the people who responded, and then how familiar, we have quite a range. Oh, that's wonderful. So some online, some app, Imap Mobile App, and where you heard about it. That's so helpful for us to know. So thank you everyone for taking time. And at the end, we'll have another poll and we do kind of a comparison and see if we gained ground in some of those. And I'm guessing you might have had some other questions on the poll for this since it was year end. The last poll at the end.
Yep.
All right. And then is that, oh, right. So a few housekeeping notes. If anyone is on this call that is seeking New York State certified pesticide applicator credits, this presentation is available for 3/4 of an hour. Is that what that 0.75 means, Mitch?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. And just very important, that certification requires you to do a quiz, which Mitch will send out an email on Friday that has a link for that quiz. And then note that quiz will only be open for like 5 days. And then we send the list to the New York State Certified Pesticide Applicator group. So if you are in that cohort, please watch for that email and do the quiz as soon as possible so you can be included in that list. All right, and as I mentioned, this is the 4th in our 4-part webinar series. And I mentioned the Q&A box will be handled by Mitch and Tom and myself. And then if you're having a WebEx issue, not a question for the presenters, John Marino is handling the chat box. So if your audio isn't working or, you know what, John, why don't you throw a quick chat text out that just says, you know, enter here if you have any tech issues, so audio WebEx issues. All right. And then I think with that, I pass the mic to Mitchell. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for introducing. I just wanted to start with a very quick update of how this project has been going. So we did our first webinar on this effort back in February. That's about when we opened up grid squares and tried to get volunteers to sign up for them to survey for Tree of Heaven and spotted lanternfly. And for anyone new to this, and if you don't know what any of that means, we will talk about that more later. So you don't have to worry about the details right now. I just wanted to highlight some of the efforts that have been going on across the state. So we have a a map here that shows the spotted lanternfly survey efforts by county. It's really important for me to note that these are not showing where spotted lanternfly is. It's just showing where we have a survey record for spotted lanternfly. So for instance, up here in Rochester, it's in the, I think it's the 75-ish range. That means there were 75 records, and all of these were not detected records for spotted lanternfly. So most of the red you see in upstate New York is from negative surveys, but those are super important. So now we know that someone checked in the Rochester area in Monroe County, and they did not find it. And there are many records, which is very useful as opposed to a county where we're not sure if anyone has checked yet. So thank you so much to everyone who has submitted spotted lanternfly survey records to iMapInvasives. Even if they've all been not detected, those are extremely valuable. So all in all, we've had 322 grid squares across the state claimed by volunteers. And we've also had almost 2,000 records submitted to IMAP. And so that includes Tree of Heaven records, spotted lanternfly records, presence and not detected. And it's a lot of great effort has happened, but I will note that there is still plenty of room for your help. So you'll see in particular some areas in the southern tier where we haven't had many surveys. So there are plenty of grid squares left to sign up for. And of course, spotted lanternfly moves. So we really need people to keep looking. So I encourage you all to sign up for Grid Square today at nyimapinvasives.org/SLF. And I wanted to note that we recently added a couple new focus grid squares, mostly surrounding some lakes where we saw that there was a lot of boat traffic from out of state people. So people from New Jersey and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where spotted lanternfly is more widespread than New York. So these are potential locations for spread. So in case there were hitchhikers on like a spotted lanternfly hitchhikers that hitchhiked onto vehicles traveling to these areas. So we opened up those grid squares. So hopefully people can check to see if there are any spotted lanternfly in those areas. And then with that, I think we switch over to Tom.
Again, I'm Tom Halgey, Invasive Species Coordinator, New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets within the Division of Plant Industry. And you're probably, after this being the fourth part, if any of you have been with us all through this journey, you're probably sick of hearing me talk about spotted lanternfly. But I do try to change it up a little bit and focus on a different life stage each time. So I'm not repeating myself entirely, although some slides may seem familiar. Next slide. So spotted lanternfly is a native to parts of Asia, including China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam. It was first discovered in Pennsylvania in 2014. It's also invasive in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world, like South Korea and India. They use their piercing, sucking mouth parts to feed on sap from about 70 different plant species. A little bit more than that, I think. We're finding some new species here in New York, like Oriental bittersweet, that it likes to feed on. So they don't bite, they don't sting, but they do have piercing, sucking mouth parts, very similar to, say, an aphid. And they're filter feeders. They don't really suck the sap out. The sap sort of passes through them, and they filter it out. And as it passes through, their excrement is known as honeydew. It's a very sugary, sweet excrement. So I'll bring that up later. It's kind of pertinent. They prefer Tree of Heaven, or Ailanthus altissima. It's not their only, as I mentioned, it's not their only host plant, but it's their preferred host. Some of the plants that we're most concerned with here within the department are grapes, apples, hops, raspberries, blueberries, maples, walnuts, and the list goes on. But some very high dollar, very, very economically important agricultural crops for New York State, considering we're number 2 in number 2 in apple production, number 3 in the U.S. for grape production. And we're also trying to redevelop our hops production here in New York State. So basically, if you like beer, wine, and cider, you should be concerned about spotted lanternfly. Next slide. Potentially, spotted lanternfly has a very broad range, about half of the U.S., as you can see from this map. The Midwestern area is a little bit too dry, and there's not really a lot of habitat for it in the Great Plains. But throughout the East and the central U.S., there's quite a bit of habitat, and we're kind of right in the middle of that. Next slide. So where is spotted lanternfly? This map was just updated a few days ago. As you can see, the blue areas are known populations, but not so much to panic over this because, like you can see, Tompkins County in New York State, the whole county is shaded blue, where the actual population is only in a small area in Ithaca, along with the 12 other counties that we have in New York State. Although Nassau and Suffolk County are not shaded in yet, we're still trying to determine just where exactly it is within those counties. Nassau County, it's primarily along the Brooklyn-Queens border, and also along the southern, some of the oceanside beaches along Nassau County's south shore. In Suffolk County, we've confirmed populations in Amityville, Farmingdale, and also in Bohemia. We've had reports in many other places. As you can see, the little red dots. Most of those are either single insects that were hitchhikers or dead insects that were found, but not viable populations. But you can see how it's spread out from Berks County, Pennsylvania, over the years, and it's finally spread to New York and spreading within New York at this point. Next slide. So what is spotted lanternfly? I mentioned it was a plant hopper, I believe, and that it's from where it's from, but its life stages. So it overwinters as an egg mass. The adults are killed off by the first hard freeze. A frost will not kill them. It takes a really heavy freeze to kill off the adults. They hatch out in late April, early May. They're very, very tiny. The photo there on the left of the black and white nymph, the early instar nymphs, that's perched upon a spruce needle. So you get the size of the insect. It's very, very tiny, often confused for being a tick because it's so small. Now, once they first hatch out, they disperse. They'll metamorphosize 3 times. So they'll shed their exoskeleton 3 times, and each time is considered an instar. So the 4th time that they metamorphosize, the 4th instar develops these red wing pads and red markings, and they're a little bit larger. They're about the size of a dime. So at that point, they're very, very easy to spot in the environment. We start getting reports during that period of time. Midsummer is typically when we start finding those. Again, they metamorphosize. They basically break out of their exoskeleton, and when they emerge, they have their fully developed wings as an adult. They're about 1 inch in length, 3/4 to 1 inch in length. And that's the life stage we're really finding right now is the adults. Kind of towards the end of the adult life stage, and the females are starting to lay eggs. So we're kind of in 2 feet, 1 foot in each world there, in the adult and eggs. That's kind of the life stage that we're at currently. Not all the egg masses are covered, as you can see in the life cycle photo on the right of the egg masses. Some of them are covered, some of them are partially covered, some of them aren't covered at all. The eggs look very much like caraway seeds glued to the side of a tree. There's typically 40 to 60 in nice, neat little rows, vertical rows. They're always kind of linear like that. The waxy substance that they cover them with, it changes in color and texture, so it's very hard to describe. It's very putty-like or mud-like. You can see the freshly laid one there, still kind of glossy and smooth. And then all the way off to the left, the egg mass there looks kind of dry and chalky and cracked. almost like dried sap or mud. So there's great variability in the color and texture of the egg masses. But what they vary from greatly is their look-alike, which is gypsy moth eggs, which are very much like paper mache, and oval in shape. So that they're not paper mache-like, they're not fuzzy. They're typically have this other coating to them. So next slide. Again, there's 4 life stages. Currently, we're kind of between 4 and 1, but we can find both of those life stages. Typically, throughout the year, you can find multiple life stages. At some parts of the summer, you can actually find early nymphs, first, second, third instar nymphs, fourth instar nymphs, and adults all at the same time. There is some overlap, so they don't all hatch at the same time. There is some, early and late hatching. Next slide. Again, we're kind of in this zone here between October and November. Most likely to find egg masses a little bit later in the month, but right now we're still finding quite a few adults, especially gravid females that are full of eggs getting ready to lay. So, next slide. And here's what the adults look like. This is the most common picture. With the wings spread, it looks very much like a moth or a butterfly, although it's not a Lepidoptera. It's not a lanternfly either. It's really a plant hopper. But it's a beautiful looking insect, although very destructive. You're not often likely to find it looking like this in the environment, unless they're just getting ready to take flight. So, next slide. I mean, as I mentioned, they're very beautiful. They can be quite menacing, as this photo on the bottom right. What's important about that is, of course, it's zoomed in, but you can see that proboscis, that feeding mouth part there, right down the center, tapping into that twig. All right, thank you, Mitch. He's moving the cursor around there. So, as beautiful as they are, they are threatening to the environment, to agriculture, and they're also a nuisance pest. I'll get into that more later. But again, you're not likely to find them, in beautiful photos like this are kind of rare. In the environment, you're really not going to see them in this stage. But a lot of the early literature had them, kind of depicted as these beautiful insects. Next page. What you're most likely going to find is this photo on the left. Very kind of indescript, waiting to hop away. They're plant hoppers. They will hop before they walk, before they fly. They're very good at hiding from people. You see them, you approach them, and then they hop very quickly. So they're very mobile. They're also fairly good flyers. They don't fly very far. And their flight patterns and reasoning for that are really not really well understood yet. But in Pennsylvania, they've certainly been observed migrating from tree lines to grape orchards and kind of going a little bit further distances than what we originally thought. But often it's this profile view that you'll see them, like on this one here, perched on what appears to be a vine. In the environment, you're either going to see the dorsal view from above or the lateral view from the side, and they blend in pretty well sometimes in the environment. So, next slide. As I mentioned, they do blend in well. You can see the color patterns on the one on the right there. That's on grapevines, so it blends in really well. A little bit of the red underwing there showing, but the coloring, especially this time of year when things are starting to senesce, the coloring really blends into the environment. And also this time of year, they're active doing what they're doing on the left there. You can see at least 3 adults in there. One of them is a female. You can see that yellow underbelly. That starts to be exposed when they're gravid. But you can see egg masses there. So they found this little niche in a tree where there's some cat facing and the bark is peeled back. And they've gotten that little cavity and protected area. And they've gotten in there and they're laying eggs. Typically, if you find one egg mass, Others are attracted to that, so there'll be multiple egg masses in one location. And they also like to hide their eggs. Not so much hide them, but they're protecting them. They put them in protected areas, the undersides of fence rails, the undersides of outdoor patio furniture, underneath vehicles, in cracked, cat facings on trees. So the eggs are a little bit more protected, a little bit harder to see. So they're not always exposed, where you can see them readily. Sometimes you got to really peer into some cracks and crevices. So, next slide. I mentioned the Gravid Females. The photo on the right came into us a few weeks ago. That was one of the first Gravid Females that were reported in New York State this year. You have a really good view there on the left. That yellow abdomen really showing clearly. They only swell up like that when they're ready to lay eggs. Before that, they're quite dark colored underneath. And that yellow is really not visible at all or barely visible. You can tell the one on the right is really ready to pop. She's just raring to lay eggs. As I mentioned, there are about 40 to 60 eggs per mass. Each female is capable of depositing multiple egg masses. And some of them are covered, some of them aren't, as I mentioned earlier. There's no real rhyme or reason to why they cover some or not cover others. We don't know if it's a resource, it's a nutrient lacking issue, or they're just being lazy, or there might be some sort of, survivability niche to it. But some of them are covered, some of them aren't, which makes it even harder for detection, but there's not one single thing they'll really be looking for. Next slide. When you're out there surveying, if you're taking a look around, it's always good to have a flashlight. You could see these photos were taken on a nice, bright, clear day. You could see the sky in the background. There might be a couple puffy clouds. But these pine limbs, were quite shaded. Pine is not a host, but these white pine trees had egg masses deposited on them, which could clearly, very easily look like sap or lichen. But there's a couple egg masses there. You can see right in the center of the left side. That's very linear, freshly laid egg mass from last year. So even though you're out during the day, it might seem silly, but a flashlight is a good tool to have with you, as is a laser pointer. If you're with someone else saying, "Oh, look at that spot. What spot are you looking at?" A laser pointer helps kind of make sure that we're all looking at the same thing at the same time. So just kind of tools for the trade if you're out there surveying. So, next page. As I mentioned earlier, there was that photo of the adults laying under the bark. Here's one the USDA found last fall. And again, it was some cat facing, and the bark had peeled back over this tree, which I believe was a sugar maple. And there was an egg mass up underneath the wound wood, underneath the bark, peeling bark. So you really have to not just look at the surface of the tree, you have to kind of look in the nooks and crannies. That's really where you're going to find, especially in a low population, whether or not as prolific. So, next slide. Again, underneath things, the underside of things, the inside of this tire, this rim, has egg masses on the tire and the rim. They're attracted to rusty metal, but they'll lay eggs on any flat surface exposed to the environment. Pretty much anything is fair game if it's outside and not moving, if it has a flat surface, but they're more likely to lay on something that has rusty metal. We don't know if it's a texture or what attracts them to rusty metal, but it's very common to find them on rusty metal. On the left side there, you can see some variability in the egg masses where, she hadn't quite finished laying an orderly row on the bottom right, or even the photo in the center. But you can see how the covering is kind of chalky white and globular in the center photo, and it's very smooth and blends in very well with the bark of that tree of heaven on the left side, where she's already covered those egg masses. So there's, it just makes it that much more difficult to confirm whether it's spotted lanternfly egg masses or something else. The egg mass there in the center looks quite like sap dripping from a pine. So, next page. basically it's the same photo as before. I just wanted to stress that, how well it blends in. The young covered eggs are a little bit easier to spot, but that little splotch, the covered eggs there on the left, with concerning the color and the bark pattern on that tree of heaven, it blends in very, very well. Next page. When the eggs are first laid, they're quite white. As you can see this on the left side there, there's a couple egg masses. I see at least 4 egg masses in that photo. Upper right looks like there's 2. The freshly laid egg mass in the white, and then the slightly aged one to the left. And they go from white to that tannish color within just a few minutes of being laid. It's not a very long period of time. As I mentioned earlier, the undersides of things, this railroad track here, for a human surveyor, it's very difficult to survey underneath something like that without an inspectional mirror. But the detector dogs that are available are really good at finding things in locations like that. But again, the whole railroad track, miles and miles of it, and where do they find the egg mass is underneath in the protected area. This little camp chair on the right is loaded with egg masses, and that's the sort of thing that we're concerned with. That somebody's going to grab this chair and bring it to their camp. It's hunting season. They might be traveling, to a hunting camp or to a vacation spot, or packing up things from the lake cabin and bringing them home, and accidentally moving around material like this, whether it's a folding chair, a canoe, or even a snowplow or a camper. Anything that they could lay eggs on that's exposed to the environment is fair game. So it's always a good idea to check those survey areas of not just the trees and stones, but also movable objects. So, next page. Some of the other indicators of spotted lanternfly are during a heavy infestation. You can see here on the left all those adults massed on that tree. All that heavy feeding produces an abundance of sap, of honeydew. You can see the black sooty mold that's blooming, and it also starts to get late in the fall, like this time of year. That honeydew will start to ferment, and it gives off almost like an alcohol smell. It'll be like a fermenting fruit. If you've ever been in an apple orchard where the apple drops have begun to ferment, it smells similar to that. That sweet smell, that fermenting smell, will attract other stinging insects like this European hornet here in this bottom right photo. And no, that is not an Asian giant hornet. It's actually probably a yellow jacket, looking at the legs that are yellow there. So yellow jackets, European hornets, other stinging insects are attracted to that sweet honeydew as well. The honeydew can also be a slip hazard. You can see this person was power washing their walkway and rode out sooty mold. You can see the clear, clean spot on the left on the flagstones, and then the rest of it's just a slippery mess of black sooty mold. So it could be a safety hazard. It's certainly an aesthetic hazard to that walkway. Whether it's someone's backyard, or if it's a park setting or a playground or kids' play equipment, or your car, you really wouldn't want all that sooty mold all over your car. So that's some of the other things that we're concerned with besides agricultural crops. And other things that might key you in, if you start seeing sooty mold on things or abundance of stinging insects like yellow jackets congregating, especially at the base of a tree, or this, frothy, mold spores occurring, you start looking around, there might be a spotted lanternfly population. So, next slide. Again, I mentioned that, being on your car, as you can see the difference between the door, which is still dirty, compared to the roof, which is just covered with sooty mold, and the windshield. You could see where that could be not just a nuisance, but a hazard. The left side there, again, the underside of an object and rusty metal all combined into one, and it's mobile. It's on wheels. A tractor trailer can easily be hooked up and transported to a new location. Those egg masses will hatch out in the spring, and you have a new population. Excuse me. Take a really good look at the underside of materials, equipment and things like that, you might not always see them on the surface, but the undersides, the protected areas, little nooks and crannies are places where you'll find egg masses, particularly for rusty objects like this tractor trailer. So, next slide. Can you spot the egg mass there on that tree of heaven? If you have good eyesight and you're kind of tuned to checking, looking for egg masses, and of course right now you're really focused on it, but if Mitch clicks one more time, it should highlight it. It's right there in the center. And if he goes back one, it just, it just disappears into that tree bark. It's very difficult to spot these sometimes. So thanks, Mitch. So just keep an eye and take a really good close look at some of these locations. So as far as the spotted lanternfly itself, my take-home messages for this episode, this session, are currently that we're looking at adults and egg stages. They can both be found. Egg masses can be found on any flat surface outside. It's not just tree of heaven or stone, or or it's not just rusty metal, although they prefer rusty metal. But any flat object, particularly if it's a protected location. The adults will be present until there's a first hard freeze. A frost will not kill the adults. It slows them down. We've had a first frost up here at least by me, but I'm pretty far north of Albany. But it's going to take a really hard freeze to kill off the adults. And as Meg mentioned earlier, negative survey is good. So just because you're out there looking and don't find anything, don't think that's not valuable. It's extremely valuable. As we survey, if we see that an area has been looked at and there's no negative survey, we can focus our efforts someplace else. We know that area has been looked at and nothing's been found. So negative is not always bad. So negative survey, negative data is always good. So thank you much.
Thank you, Tom. Mitch, do you want me to cover any short questions now, or do you want to save them all for the Q&A section?
I think there was one more slide.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Yep. So if you need more information than what we give out today, there's always the Cornell Cooperative Extension IPM site. There's lists of pesticides that are available, the current map. It's a wealth of information. So for informational purposes, the Cornell site, if you Google Cornell spotted lanternfly, this site comes up, or we can cut and paste the link there on the right if anybody needs it. So, sorry, Meg.
No, that's great. Thank you, Tom. Mitch, I think you were saying we have time for a couple. There's more than I think we want to cover right now.
I was going to suggest maybe one right now.
Sure. I think the one that's most applicable to what was just covered by Tom, and I hope I didn't catch that you mentioned this. Did you mention if they're egg mass lookalikes?
I did touch on the gypsy moth egg masses that look like them.
Okay.
And that's really the most common thing. Some of the other things that I kind of mentioned in passing were lichen and sap. So occasionally there'll be a splotch of sap from either a broken twig or maybe a squirrel was feeding on something, and there's a little blotch of sap on something versus lichen, which is very easy to determine it's not an egg mass. But the most common thing that's confused as a lookalike for the egg masses are gypsy moths. But again, as I mentioned, they have like a gypsy moth has a paper mache type material to the outside. They're very fuzzy. They are quite linear and kind of oval in shape, so the shape is very similar, but the texture is extremely different, where the spotted lanternfly egg masses look more like either mud or it's more chalky, more earth tones, where the gypsy moth egg masses are almost consistently a light tan color, and they're more like paper mache. And the eggs themselves are round and not very well organized within the egg mass for gypsy moth, where the egg masses for spotted lanternfly are always going to be laid in linear lines and adjacent to each other, typically, where there's 30 to 40 or 40 to 60 eggs per egg mass.
Great.
So,
Well, Tom, thanks for covering that again. It is good to those descriptions stick in my head better. And the rest, there's some wonderful questions, but let's make sure we stay on target with time and move on to the Tree of Heaven, and then we'll cover these other in the Q&A at the end.
sure. Sorry, I just need to take a quick drink there. And you're stuck with me again for part 2 here for identification of Tree of Heaven, Alanthus altissima. You can see the kind of this aerial view here of Alanthus looking down. It looks quite tropical, and it is. It's not native to the U.S. It's also an invasive species, but we'll talk about that a little bit. So next page. So Tree of Heaven, sometimes just abbreviated to TOH. And how we are with government, we like our acronyms. So the native range is Central Asia and Taiwan. The habitat, it'll tolerate poor soils. It'll grow in just about any soils. It grows well in urban areas where it's, disturbed soil, forgotten kind of areas, the periphery of construction site or cleared land, areas that aren't well groomed. It's typically where you'll find it growing. It does like sun, especially when they're young. Once they get established, they can tolerate a little bit more shade. They're quite drought tolerant, so they don't need a lot of water. You can find them growing, like as I mentioned, kind of formerly disturbed areas, bare soil. It'll take hold and it'll kind of outcompete everything else. One of the reasons why it's an invasive species. Once it gets established, they grow in colonies. They shade out the other growth. They do exude an allelopathic compound in the soil, very similar to black walnut, where it inhibits the growth of other plants. It changes the soil nutrient cycling, so that's also a concern. As far as New York State invasive species assessments for regulating invasive species, it was rated as a moderate risk. It can damage buildings with its roots and foundations and sidewalks and walkways. Many trees can do that, but just because Alanthus will grow in the crack of a sidewalk, it will literally grow up in the tiniest of cracks and start to separate the soil. And if there's no soil there, it'll start to separate the cement. It's definitely the preferred host for spotted lanternfly. It's not a required host. Spotted lanternfly can complete its life cycle on other plants, but they much prefer spotted lanternfly over other plants, especially at certain life stages. So, next page. A little history about spotted. I'm still stuck on the other slides. Sorry, a little history about Tree of Heaven. It was first brought here in the middle of the 18th century as a horticultural plant. It was also brought here thinking that we could produce silk moths here in the U.S. and kind of build up the silk industry in the U.S. And that really didn't work out too well. But some of the arboretums around the Pennsylvania area propagated the plant, and they've since spread to many, many states since then. In the West, it's not as much of a problem, although it will grow out there. Some of the trees were moved out quite early. Some of them still exist as street trees, but with the much drier environments, even though they're drought tolerant, they don't fare as well in some of the western states as they do in the east. Some people plant these in urban areas because it will grow, and it might be the only tree that they can grow. And it was also the subject that a tree grows in Brooklyn. So the tree that grows in Brooklyn was a novel by Betty Smith, and the tree that she's discussing is Alanthus altissima. So there is kind of some attachment to it for those reasons. Next page. The growth form, as I mentioned earlier, it will kind of clump. It'll grow in colonies. The roots will graft. They can reach quite a large height, 80 feet or so. They can get quite big in diameter, so you can get large diameter breast height trees, DBH. but then the seeds spread out further and further, and then also the common name kind of comes out from the way it grows. It grows towards heaven. It grows very fast. But more likely, you're going to see trees like this here in the bottom right in the center, where the small shrubby, small trees, kind of tender growth, and that's really what spotted lanternfly, especially the early life stages, goes for, is this tender new growth versus the established mature trees. They migrate towards the mature trees later on in their life stage, around now, just before mating. Actually, so late September, early October, they'll migrate towards the mature trees. But earlier on, they prefer the younger, easier to feed on, tender new growth. Next page. They have an alternate leaf arrangement, so those not familiar with tree ID, typically plants, not just trees, but plants in general, have an alternate leaf arrangement, opposite leaf arrangement, or whorled. Whorled is much less common. Alternate just means that where the leaves attach, where the stems attach, alternate. So they're not directly across from each other. We're with an opposite branching pattern. So next page. And they also have pinnate leaves, and they have compound pinnate leaves. So the leaves narrow to a little point. They're opposite each other, and each one of these pictures is one leaf. So the little leaflets there's leaflets on one leaf versus a simple leaf where it would all be in one. So a compound leaf is either pinnate or I can't think of or palmate, sorry. So it's not shaped like a hand, it's long and narrow, that's pinnate. And you can see the tip of the pinnate leaf there. There's one leaf that comes off at the center. I'll mention that again later. So next page. One thing to notice about that's easy to spot for Tree of Heaven is the little notch at the bottom of each leaflet. So the leaflet has that little thumb, that little rounded tooth, and each one of those has a little gland. You could almost see it in the bottom left photo there. Right at the tip of the notch, there's a little green dot. So that's the little glandular dots on the underside of that notch are one way to confirm that this is Tree of Heaven and not some other plant. So next slide. So the flowers are kind of nondescript. They're not very showy. In particular, they're white or creamish color. The male and female flowers on separate trees, but only the females produce fruit. So they'll both flower. You need a male and a female for pollination, and then the females will produce the seed. So, next slide. The Cedar Samara is very similar to ash trees, a little different than maples because they're single Samaras. So it's very much looks like the clusters of seed from an ash tree. You can see that they turn brown when they first emerge. They're quite green. They redden up a bit. They're quite showy actually. And then once they dry up, kind of the stage that we're at now is the top center there, where the seeds are clustered on the female trees, and they're easy to spot. And those clusters persist for quite some time into the winter. So, next page. So the pith, the center of the twigs is the pith, is soft, and so they have pith. Not all twigs have pith, but that soft center stage, center portion of the twig, it's not a hard substance. It's very flaky and pith-like. I don't know how else to describe it. They also have a smell that's been described as burnt peanut butter. I've never smelled burnt peanut butter before, but I know that these trees have smelled Tree of Heaven, and they have a foul odor, not a pleasant odor. It's a very distinct odor. So if you crush up the leaves or you break a twig and smell it, you probably only need to do it once to recognize the smell. It's not a very pleasant smell. So, So next page. The bark of the tree of heaven varies as it grows older. It's quite smooth. You can see on the right side there, those fresh new saplings, they're probably about ½ inch in diameter. It's very smooth, slightly greenish looking, but as they start to grow, they look like almost like cantaloupe. The skin of a cantaloupe is the way it's been described, and I think it's pretty accurate. Just the color and texture looks very much like cantaloupe skin. When they get much older and much broader, they get a little bit more furrowed, but you can still see this cantaloupe type skin further up in the canopy. So, next page. In the spring, early spring, they'll come up. The fresh new growth has this red coloring to it. So when the buds first break, that first flush of growth is quite red and striking. It's easy to spot early in the spring. And then you can see the tender new growth that develops shortly after that. And that's right around the same time that you would be seeing the early instar nymphs for spotted lanternfly. So it's timed perfectly well with their emergence. Next page. Again, with the twigs, which is the best way to identify it in the winter, there's a few things out there that look similar. Walnut is one, sumac is another, but really doesn't matter if you're looking for spotted lanternfly. They're both hosts, so it's not so critical to determine whether you have walnut, tree of heaven, or sumac. Another thing that looks similar is horse chestnut, although the twigs of horse chestnut are very easy to identify. The terminal bud, the bud at the tip, is very large. You can see it's actually wider than the twig. So that's one way to distinguish horse chestnut from the others. Horse chestnut are also opposite branching. So tree of heaven has quite a large leaf scar. It's almost like a crescent shape with the bud in the center. So the terminal leaf scar, you can see the vascular bundle scars. So those little dots that kind of line the outside of that crescent, and then the bud in the top center, which will leaf out again next year. So, next slide. So as I mentioned, some of the lookalikes, sumac. The leaflets for sumac look very much like tree of heaven. However, they don't have that same smell, and they don't have the leaf notch that tree of heaven would have. And the seed heads for sumac will persist through the winter. You could see them as you're driving down the highways, and the branching pattern is quite different too. Where a tree of heaven has a tendency to kind of grow in an upright fashion, more vase-like, where sumac will grow quite stout and broad. And the picture on the right shows both. So you can see the sumac in the foreground, kind of the lower area, and then the much taller tree of heaven in the background. So the growth habit is quite different between the two. And again, the sumac branches are kind of sort of flattened at the tips, and they don't have the very large leaf scars that tree of heaven has. Next slide. Again, just a close-up of the sumac leaves. They're slightly different shape. They don't have they're very uniform on both sides of the leaflet. They don't have that notch in the base of the leaf that sumac would have, but they do have the terminal leaflet because they're opposite. The terminal leaflet does come off as one leaflet, so it's somewhat easy to be confused with tree of heaven. So, next page. Again, the sap. I mentioned about the smell of the sap, but tree of heaven sap is clear. Sumac sap is milky white. So if you break the leaflet or you break a twig, the white milky sap is always going to be sumac, and it's quite sticky. So next page. Walnuts also look very similar. There are some leaf scars. They're pretty small, and the buds are much larger, and the bud is positioned way above the leaf scar. on black walnut, and especially this time of year, the nuts themselves, they're about a little bit bigger than a golf ball, typically green to brown. If they're not still persisting on the tree this time of year, you'll find them on the ground. I wouldn't recommend picking them up with a bare hand, as they will stain your hand brown. But the fruit is quite different than the Samaras on the tree of heaven. So if you see the round fruit hanging, it's certainly not a tree of heaven. It's more likely to be a black walnut. And the leaflets are also opposite, and they're not and they're much glossier. Next page. Ash is another lookalike, and you can see the tree of heaven to the right. Ash does have a compound leaf, but typically it's a much shorter leaf. It's much shorter, less leaflets to their to the leaf. Not easily confused with tree of heaven. So, next page.
Thank you so much, Tom. There's a bunch of questions in the chat box, in the Q&A that I encourage you to take a look at once I start presenting. And thank you so much for your great overview.
Mitch, I also
Meg, do you think? Okay, go ahead.
I did grab those questions and I put them in a Word doc, and would it be helpful if I throw that Word doc up into SharePoint or just keep it on my screen?
Just on your screen is probably good.
Okay. You're flashing gray at the moment there.
What?
It stopped.
It stopped. I think it's probably when you look at the chat box that we see your gray.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Thank you. All right. Well, I guess I'll get started then. So I'm going to talk about how iMapInvasives fits into this. So why is iMapInvasives relevant to spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven and the efforts to monitor and manage them? So IMAP is an online platform used in a couple jurisdictions, so states and provinces across North America. In New York, it's the centralized invasive species database to support PRISMs, state agencies, and other partners working on invasive species issues. So general public as well as professionals can submit records to iMapInvasives, and you can view species distributions and generate reports. You can also sign up for early detection alerts. That's how a lot of professionals stay in touch with new observations of invasive species across the state. And you can even record and track management efforts. Today, we'll mostly be talking about how to report observations. Just to give you a brief overview of how the database is structured, there are three main data types. So one is presence. So presence records, these are where you indicate where you found an invasive species. So say you went out to a park and you saw a tree of heaven, you could submit a presence record for tree of heaven. We also have not detected records where you indicate a species that you looked for but did not find. So say you checked that tree of heaven for spotted lanternfly, but you didn't find anything, then you could submit a not detected spotted lanternfly record, which is very useful. You can also report treatments in iMapInvasives. That's used most heavily by professionals, and it's not directly related to this volunteer project, so we're not going to talk too much about that specifically today, but it is available. And I wanted to mention the two main types of presence records. So there's confirmed records where someone has reviewed the record. Usually they check the photo, make sure it matches the species listed, and then they set it to confirmed. There are also unconfirmed records. So these are simply records where that review process has not happened yet. So they're not necessarily wrong, they're just waiting for further review before they're considered confirmed. And there is a very small amount of data on IMAP, a small number of species where the data is actually not visible publicly. So most of our data is visible publicly. So you could search Tree of Heaven and see all the records of Tree of Heaven across the state to see if it's near you. For a couple high priority species that are new to the state and have regulatory concerns, one of them being spotted lanternfly, the data is actually obscured from public view, so it's viewable by a small subset of professionals across the state. For instance, Tom, of course, can view the spotted lanternfly records because he's the main person going in and reviewing those records. But most people would not be able to see spotted lanternfly records. And just to give you a little view of what happens to records once you submit them to IMAP. So they go in as unconfirmed. And for regulated or high priority species, there are professionals across the state who have email alerts set up. They then verify those records. For spotted lanternfly, of course, that's ag and markets. And so they would be the ones confirming those records. For non-confidential species, once the species is set to confirmed, various people across the state might have email alerts set up to see those records come in. For other species that maybe are not, they don't have that high priority regulation status, something like Tree of Heaven, which is a very important invasive species, but not as of concern as spotted lanternfly. So those ones are reviewed by the IMAP team, as well as our huge network of confirmers across the state who review records, including PRISM staff, agency staff, even some volunteers. And then those records are viewable in the database and can trigger email alerts to anyone who has them set up. And so IMAP provides a platform for both the general public and professionals to submit data, and it has a built-in process for professionals and state authorities to review that data. And because of that, this really sets it up as a very useful tool for spotted lanternfly monitoring efforts. So we noticed this need in New York State. So New York State needs the help of people all across the state to monitor spotted lanternfly. It's a huge state. It would be nearly impossible for any one entity to cover every inch of the state. So we really need more eyes on the ground. People living in their local areas, they know their local areas best. So we really need your help to keep your eye out and see if there's any new species like spotted lanternfly. So we really just need more eyes on the ground to monitor spotted lanternfly. And we also need the data in a centralized database where ag and markets can review reports. And so we collaborate, the IMAP team collaborated with ag and markets to come up with this volunteer initiative where we ask volunteers across the state to pick a location to survey, check for spotted lanternfly and its host plant or preferred host, Tree of Heaven, at multiple points throughout the year, and then report presence and not detected records to iMapInvasives. And for that pick a location part, state partners have actually selected 1 kilometer grid squares across the state, which were identified as ideal areas to check for spotted lanternfly for volunteers for a couple reasons, which I'll go into later. And so you can claim a grid square at nyimapinvasives.org/SLF, and we encourage anyone interested to participate. And so essentially, what participating means is that you follow these 4 steps. So you set up an iMapInvasives account if you don't have one already. You select a grid square to survey. You prep for the survey for submitting records, and then you actually go and conduct the survey and submit those records. And I'll talk a little bit about each step, but there is a full list of detailed steps at this website here. So I'll talk about step 1 first, which is creating an IMAP account. So to do that, you use our online web application. We recommend Chrome, Firefox, or Safari for the most part. Internet Explorer will not work. And to get to the online interface, you go to our website at iMapInvasives.org, and there's this login button on the right-hand side. And that brings you to our account creation and login page. If you have an account, you can log in up there. If you haven't logged in a long time, you might want to try the forgot password link, especially if it's been a couple years. You'll have to reactivate your account using that button. And if you don't have an account, you can use the sign up box below. So put in your information, make sure you use an email that you have access to, and put in New York for your jurisdiction. And once you hit join, an email will be sent to your inbox. Make sure you go into your inbox and check that. Sometimes it's in the spam or junk folder, but make sure you open that email and follow the link to the user agreement so that you can accept the agreement and activate your account, at which point you'll be able to log in. And so you can create records, you can view data. There's a lot of things you can do online. But the main thing you need to do online first is just to create that account. And then step 2 is selecting a place to survey. So we have actually set up a sign-up map on that website, nyimapinvasives.org/SLF. And so we laid a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid across the state, and we picked out some places where we really need help looking for spotted lanternfly. So places where volunteer efforts would be really useful to complement efforts underway by agencies already. So there's the most important ones are these orange focus grid squares. That's where those were handpicked mostly by Ag and Market staff as areas where we really want help looking for spotted lanternfly. And then there's also these blue grid squares, which they intersect with public access land, for the most part, state parks. And then there's these purple grid squares, and those are squares where there have been reports of tree of heaven already. So those are areas that have a slightly elevated risk for spotted lanternfly since they really like that tree so much. And we do just want to note that you might look at this map and you might not see the area you were hoping to survey. So say there's some local park or you have some property that you wanted to survey. If that's not on the grid squares, that's totally okay. We still would really appreciate your participation. So any spotted lanternfly or tree of heaven efforts are very useful. We would still love for you to check those areas that you're interested in for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. Report presence and not detected records back to IMAP. You can fully participate. You just would skip the grid square step. So the grid squares are really to help direct most of our volunteers to these high priority areas where we need your help surveying. And then so once you have your location picked out, oh, and I should mention on our website, it's all the way down at you scroll down to get to the map. It's at the bottom, and there's a lot of tips on how to use the map. So I encourage you to just take a look at that and then open up the map, and it's a pretty quick process to look in your area and pick a grid square you're interested in. And then step 3 is to prepare for the survey. So you've made an IMAP account, you've selected a place to survey. Now you need to make sure that you have the reporting procedure down. So there's a couple different ways to submit reports to IMAP. The most useful way for this project, I believe, is the Imap Mobile App. So this is really ideal for quick, easy data collection out in the field. You don't need to be connected to internet as long as you set it up beforehand. So it's really quick to just create a record. It'll grab your location from your phone, and you add in a picture and just indicate which species you found, and it's all very quick and easy, assuming you've set it up beforehand, which I'll talk about briefly. Another option is always the online platform, which has a lot of functionality, but that means it's not quite as streamlined. It is pretty user-friendly in many aspects, but it's not quite as easy as the mobile app. And also, of course, you need to be connected to internet. So you might not be able to access this while out on the trail. You would want to have the mobile app set up. But say you didn't have it set up and you went out and you saw spotted lanternfly and you take a picture, you could always use IMAP Online to report it later that day when you get back home. And so we really encourage you to kind of try out the reporting methods beforehand and make sure you can submit a record via the mobile app before you go out to the field, where it's much harder to troubleshoot. I'll talk about the mobile app in a little bit more detail now. So you can find that in the App Store. Just search iMapInvasives, and it'll come up in the Google Play Store as well as the App Store. And it's pretty much a 3-step workflow. You have to, when you first download it and you're still in internet connection, you have to put in your email address and password and click this Retrieve IMAP Lists. Once you get the success message there, you're good to go. Your account is linked to your app, and you're ready to go out in the field and report invasives. So basically, you just click the Add Observation button, and you are brought to this screen where you can add the photo, which is super important, and indicate the species. And you'll see here that it's a fake species selected. So that's a species we have set up so that you can select that species and submit a record just to test out the process before you've actually gone out and found an invasive species. And then, so as you go out in the field and collect your data points, those will pop up as yellow cards on the screen. And that means that they're stored on your phone, since you might not even be connected to the internet. So to get those onto our online database, the really important last step is to upload those records. So once you get back in the office or back home, you have good internet connection, what you need to do is check the box on each of those yellow record cards and then click Upload Records. And that brings all your records into the online database, and they'll disappear off of your phone. But you could always go log in online and filter on your records to see those. And I mentioned how important photos are. So you can see this blurry photo or this far up photo. Some people will probably be able to tell that they are Tree of Heaven, but it definitely takes a little bit more squinting to get there. If you take a nice close-up picture of an identifying feature and it's in focus, that's super helpful because it's very obvious what species it is when you do that, and makes confirming much easier. And you can, there are some tricks like putting your hand behind the plant or a piece of paper to add some scale and help the camera focus. But it's really just important to get a clear, in focus, close-up photo to the best of your ability. And I went through that pretty quickly. I did want to, for anyone who needs more in-depth, want a tutorial to go through everything step by step, we have a lot of resources on our training page, including our YouTube channel. And there's links to those short videos that Meg mentioned earlier that go through each step. And they're also all laid out on our imapinvasives.org/SLF page. It goes through all the steps in detail with some focus on getting IMAP set up. And there's even a link to those video tutorials there. And the last step for being a volunteer is to actually go out and do those surveys. So we recommend that, so the grid square is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. That's obviously a lot of space to cover on your own. So we're not expecting everyone to cover every inch of their square. We're recommending that people find 1 to a couple spots that are safely and publicly accessible to them and within their comfort level. Then you go and survey for spotted lanternfly and Tree of Heaven. We recommend checking the flat surfaces, both natural and man-made, so tree trunks as well as metal surfaces and other man-made surfaces. And depending on whether or not you find Tree of Heaven and spotted lanternfly, we ask you to report presence records when you find them and not detected records when you don't. There is also a time searched field in the that you can fill out when you fill out records in the mobile app. So we encourage you to fill that out. And what we recommend is maybe at least 2 or 3 minutes, up to 10 minutes if you really want to search in depth. We recommend that you spend a little bit of time searching and enter in that time in that field. And if possible, we also ask people to return to their survey sites every couple of months to detect any changes. So maybe you check for the egg masses in the next few months. You might want to check back in a few months after that, because there might be more, there might be egg masses you didn't notice the first time, or you might even get to the part of the year where there is emergence of the instar nymphs. And so that was a really quick recap of the roles of a volunteer in this project. If you're interested, I encourage you to go to our website at nyimapinvasives.org/SLF for some more detail. But now we were going to shift and talk about the goals for the rest of the year and the plans for next year, as well as looking back at this past year. So trying to get at the question of, has this effort been useful so far? And the first bullet I have here, I'm wondering about the ag markets perspective. So Tom, would you be able to speak for a minute or two on that?
I'm sorry, Mitch. I was answering questions in the Q&A. Could you say that again?
Oh yeah, sorry. We're wondering how has this effort been useful from ag and markets perspective?
It would be an understatement if I said it was extremely useful, because not only are we getting many more reports in iMapInvasives, but it's also enabling us to better direct our staff and other state staff, so we can concentrate our efforts, in different areas. In the chat, in the Q&A rather, there was someone that had reported one on Long Island, and that report's being followed up on already. That was kind of that was set into motion yesterday, so we can quickly respond to the new finds versus someone reporting it in Staten Island. We know it's there, so we can better direct our resources to the areas where we don't know it is, to the new areas where, the leading edge versus the known areas. So that helps us direct our resources. And also, we're a very small agency, especially compared to an agency like DEC or DOT. We have very few staff compared to them, and we have a broad spectrum of things that we do, spotted lanternfly being one of the many. So it helps us balance our workload and direct our staff, those limited resources, and also just the cooperation that we get between other agencies. If it's on state parkland, we can tap into their invasive species programs and they can respond. So it's not always on our shoulders. And the collaborative effort, the New York, I'm going to plug the New York State Invasive Species Conference, which is coming up soon. The theme for that this year is collaboration. And this shows a great collaboration between the New York Natural Heritage Program, the IMAP team, ag and markets, and then the public, and especially the prisms. The prisms have really gotten, the partnerships for invasive species management have really jumped in, and a lot of the volunteer force, the folks that have claimed the grid are associated with a prism. Not everyone, but through that venue, it's definitely bolstered our ability to respond. So.
Thanks so much, Tom. I'm glad that this effort has been helpful. From the iMapInvasives perspective, we've also found it useful for a lot of those same reasons, but also because it's helped get data outside of where we might normally get data. So of course, we tend to get more records where more people are, obviously, and that's probably still true even with this effort, but it at least kind of gets people a little bit out of where they would normally report into these areas that have been designated as high priority for volunteers for whatever reason. May it be that it was handpicked by ag markets, or that there's Tree of Heaven there, or that it's public access land like a state park.
And to echo what you just said about data, that's another important thing. We're always being asked, or at least I'm always being asked, for data. I know I sent you and Meg an email earlier today, for data for a meeting that I have tomorrow. And having that data on hand, how many grid squares were actually looked at? Is this being used by the public? It certainly is. We're getting a tremendous response, and we're able to go through a lot of these just from the photos and either confirm or deny, whether it is spotted lanternfly or not. And the bulk of the ones that I'm the one that does most of them. I can't say I've done them all, but the bulk of the spotted lanternfly reports, come past my fingertips, and the ones that I've seen, the photos for the most part are really easy. Yep, it's definitely spotted lanternfly, and it's in New York City. Done. If it's in a new area, we take a lot more effort, and we actually send, especially if it's a new county or a new area within a county, we'll send an inspector out to confirm. Especially if it's if it's a new area, we'll take the time and dedicate the resources to doing that sort of thing. But without that data, we wouldn't be able to do that. So it's the data aspect of it has definitely been a benefit. So where if we get a couple emails, how many emails did you get? Oh, I don't know. Then someone has to track it. It's automatically tracked. The reports are there, at least at your fingertips. So the data is another aspect of it that's been a huge benefit. So, and thank you to anyone that's made any entries, whether it was spotted lanternfly or not. Just going out there, and your survey efforts are greatly appreciated.
Yes, I echo everything that Tom said. Thanks so much, everyone. And so that's what we have felt about this effort so far. But we are also interested in what our volunteers think, of course. So you may have seen a poll just pop up. I encourage you to go to the poll button on your WebEx screen and take a look at some of the questions we're asking. So some will be familiar. They're follow-up questions to the questions asked earlier today. But we also added some other questions for some feedback and ideas for next year, and that sort of stuff. And so thinking forward for the rest of the year, we really encourage people to keep an eye out for egg masses and report their surveys, even if it's not detected. It's really useful to know that someone checked for egg masses and did not find them. And that will help us be prepared for the inevitable emergence that'll be coming in spring 2022. And then for next year, we've been trying to think about how are we going to continue or adapt this effort for next year. So one is, this year we did the 4 webinars with question and answer at the end of them. We are thinking next year we can target this to some key times throughout the year, 2 webinars, May and September. So just as the nymphs are emerging, and then as the adults are becoming prominent. So that's one change, focusing our webinar efforts. But other than that, we are planning to continue this grid square effort, and we will try to incorporate some of the feedback we've gotten throughout the year and that we will continue to get to make any adjustments for next year. And the poll's only been open for a second, so I'll leave that open for a little bit longer. So maybe, Meg, do you want to start the wrap up and take home messages next?
Sure thing. Well, one thing I noticed is it's our fourth webinar on this, and these were the original take home messages on the original webinar, and everybody's reviewed them and they feel they're good. So we are reiterating them. As Tom mentioned a couple of times, a negative survey is good. That is really helpful, especially if, different times a year, still negative. So thank you for all that not detected data. From Michael, who wasn't on today's webinar, but he's been on some others, he emphasized just checking trees. It has these preferred hosts, but there's a lot of trees it likes, so just check your trees. And then Jen, who wasn't on today, but has been on some of the other webinars, just reminding everybody to make sure that you're familiar with where you're going for your grid, how to get there, and that there is safe and publicly accessible approaches for where you want to survey. Safety is always the #1 concern. And then from Mitch, reminding everyone, if you upload one of those special species called a fake species, and test and make sure that can go into IMAP, and then check on IMAP and make sure it came in and everything is all set. The issues that we troubleshoot the most often are a password that accidentally has a space at the end or something like that. But you want to figure that out while you have connectivity, and you can check that before you get out into somewhere without connectivity. So it's good to do that fake species record ahead of time. All right, so are you ready to be a detective? Today's objectives. One is we wanted to make sure everybody could identify spotted lanternfly. I think we got that covered. We do have some great questions in the Q&A for both SLF and TOH. I believe everyone had at least an overview of IMAP, and several were familiar to begin with. We did cover how to select a grid square on that special SLF page on the iMapInvasives.org webpage. And we discussed the importance of being ready to go out and survey there. So the next thing I wanted to plug was the prisms. We mentioned them several times, and most people on this call are probably familiar with them. The Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management. There are 8 of these groups across the state, and that map, you can see where you're at and their website. They are wonderful. They all have listservs. They have 4 meetings a year. They run local water chestnut polls and great webinar series, and they're a wonderful resource. So please look into your local prism. All right, so that, I believe, brings us to the Q&A section. So now I will share the doc that I have going. All right, so there were basically, I grouped them into 3 groups. Maybe we'll do TOH and then an IMAP and then an SLF group here. So Tom, the first one, as we enter late fall with lower temperatures, what is the best window of time to complete surveying an area? For example, complete by November 15th.
I'm sorry. I did answer that in the Q&A, but so everyone can see it. So basically, the answer to that question is the adults will not die off until there's a first hard freeze. So you can survey. I wouldn't put a date on it because people are all over the state. So what may occur on Long Island may not occur up in Rochester at the same date. So going by more phenology type indicators, the first hard freeze would be when you would stop surveying for adults. However, that would not stop survey because you can continue to survey for egg masses really 10 months out of the year. The only time you wouldn't survey for egg masses would be like the middle of the summer
Through winter. Got it. And I'm sorry, I did not see your answer in the Q&A thing.
I've been trying to answer them, and I got kind of bogged down on a couple of them. So,
well, you tell me if there's any here from my list that you'd rather skip. I had New York TOH require removal of mature TOH.
No, we do not require it, and in most cases we don't recommend it, because if you remove the tree of heaven, it could cause two things. If you remove it and don't treat the stumps, that tender new growth will attract spotted lanternflies. So you're just going to give them candy, basically. You're going to give them tender new growth to feed on, so you'll increase the population that way. But if you remove tree of heaven, that's just going to force tree of heaven, spotted lanternfly to find an alternate host. So they'll actually disperse. So you'll be actually spreading spotted lanternfly. So we're, on a very limited basis, if it's a site that only has, 3 egg masses and there's no other spotted lanternfly around, we might recommend removing the trees, similar to what we did in Ithaca. But for an area that has a larger population, it's just going to disperse the insects.
All right. And you probably already typed all this.
When surveying, are there bush or tree species you can skip? I would say no, because if they're not feeding on them, they could be landing on them, they could be laying eggs on them. So any flat surface outside is perfect for survey. Like I showed the picture of the pine trees, pine is not a host, but they can lay eggs on them. So when you're surveying, there really is no tree or shrub species that you would skip, because they could be found anywhere in the environment. However, you're more likely to find them on grapevines and bittersweet and tree of heaven, or even maples or black walnut than you would other things. But I wouldn't skip over some areas and others, because egg masses can be anywhere. Is it more important to look for egg masses on the preferred species? No, they'll lay egg masses anywhere. They don't necessarily lay egg masses on native, wild grape or cultivated grapes. They'll feed on them and lay eggs elsewhere. They prefer flat surfaces, and the grapes don't usually provide a broad flat surface.
All right. Well, that's great, Tom. Thank you. You want to just keep cranking here? So these are some specific SLF ones.
Sure.
Hitchhikers, egg masses only? No, absolutely not. The adults and nymphs can hitchhike as well. This insect can hitchhike in any life stage. However, the egg masses are the biggest concern, because if one insect, one adult or one nymph hitchhikes, it's not likely to introduce a new population, where if an egg mass, or typically multiple egg masses, are moved, that could initiate a new population. So the egg masses are a bigger concern, but not the only concern. Are we checking tractor trailers at the New York PA border? We have had roadside checkpoints on numerous occasions over the past few years, so yes, we have done that. However, with the populations being here in New York, we have not had any this year. We're concentrating our efforts elsewhere. And the other aspect of that is it's more, just as likely to be on, personal vehicles, private vehicles, than they are tractor trailers. But we do target transportation corridors and things like that for our survey efforts. Wouldn't you kill SLF if you saw one? Absolutely. I would take a photo and kill it and report it. Often, if it's killed first, it makes ID a lot harder. But we have ID'd some squished ones. So I can't see the list anymore. Sorry.
Great. I tried to unmute myself because I had a memory. I put something in the Q&A which may not have been accurate, Tom. I had a memory there was special directions for a new location. Like,
yes,
I know in a lot of places for egg masses, people are scraping them with a credit card, and I felt like at a new location, you've asked people not to do that.
Yes, good point. Very, very good point. So if it's an egg mass and it's not on an object that's likely to move, the best thing to do is take a photo, report it to us. If it's in a new area, a new county, a new part of an area that we're unaware of, and you can check those areas by looking at the map that's available through Spotted Lanternfly at the Cornell Spotted Lanternfly site. That map is up to date. So if it's in a new area, we would much prefer that we go out and confirm that its presence, because if you scrape the egg mass, there's nothing for us to confirm. But if it's in a known area, like if you live in any of the 5 boroughs in New York City, scrape away, scrape and stomp. So does power washing kill the eggs or disperse them? Regular power washing it'll kill some of the eggs, but it's not really an effective control method. Hot water power washing is being looked at as a more viable, more productive method, but there's still research being done on that. Is there low temperature that will kill tree of heaven or spotted lanternfly egg masses? Low temperatures more impact the spotted lanternfly survives in Korea and China. There's pretty much nowhere in New York State that's going to get too cold to kill off the egg masses. But the spotted lanternfly needs so many days. I kind of skipped over that in my spotted lanternfly section. They need so many growing degree days, so they need so many days of warm temperatures to develop into sexual maturity. In parts of New York State, there are areas where they are predicted not to reach sexual maturity, such as the heart of the Adirondacks. They just don't warm up enough, long enough for spotted lanternfly to mature to be sexually active. So it's not so much that it kills the egg masses, it just, they don't reach, there's not enough time for them to reach sexual maturity in some areas in New York. But originally it was thought cold temperatures would kill off the eggs, and it does not. So are they controlled in their native habitats? Well, in China and Vietnam, they have a host of other predators that eat them, and some of those are being looked at as biocontrols, which is kind of the next question. Some of them are being looked at as biocontrols, but that process is very, very lengthy for obvious reasons. Biocontrols have historically gone wrong in some situations. The current process to get biocontrols approved and released is very stringent compared to the way it used to be, and for good reason. So the process of finding and locating a biocontrol that won't cause other damage to the local environment is it's a daunting task. It's a very lengthy task. It takes quite a while for those processes to occur. So, but there are many things in China that feed on them, but we don't know if we can bring them here.
One quick question on that, Tom. Some people may have seen in the press photos of a praying mantis or other birds eating spotted lanternfly. Is the current line of thinking that does not significantly impact the population? I think is Penn State working on that research?
Penn State has looked at that, so has Cornell. There was actually one of those praying mantis eating an adult photos in my presentation. It's more incidental. Birds will kind of peck at them, but they really haven't developed an appetite for them yet. Part of the thinking is that the substances that they're absorbing from either black walnut or lanthus or others make them unpalatable. So they're edible, but they're just unpalatable. Even dogs and birds and things will kind of taste them and then spit them out because they're just not palatable. The incidental insect feeding, whether it's from praying mantis or others, it's not enough to control the population. Although there are some naturally occurring fungi, Bavaria being one of them, Bavaria bassiana, which has been for years been commercially available as a biopesticide. That is now available as a biopesticide for use on spotted lanternfly, and some, label restricted. It has to be used according to the label. So there are restrictions there, but that's one thing that Cornell and also Penn State are also looking at, are some of these biopesticides like Bavaria that are naturally occurring in the U.S. that can be used to combat spotted lanternfly. But again, the research is still ongoing.
Thank you for adding that question, John. So it is 2:45, so I'm going to wrap this up, and Mitch had to go do something, so I'm going to be giving our final thoughts here. One was a great question from the Q&A box came in. Someone did report egg masses to IMAP on Monday and was asking about how long it's confirmed. And I do actually know that that particular record has already been looked at and Ag and Markets is reviewing. I would say a generic answer, usually viewed within a week or so. Does that sound right, Tom?
It really depends on the availability of resources, but yeah, I would say a week or two. I discussed that earlier today in person with Frank Buccello. He's the manager for the Spotted Lanternfly program. He just happens to be here in the building for another meeting. He's not often here, but we discussed that earlier, so he's aware of it. And I don't know if staff has been assigned to go out there, but they will be shortly to go out and follow up on that, because that is a new location. And it was very unclear from the photos. There were good photos. It was just unclear from the photos if it was actually spotted lanternfly eggs or some other insect. It was difficult to tell from the photos. So we're going to have somebody go out there and take a look, especially because it's close to the orchard and vineyard growing area of eastern Long Island. So I'm very familiar with that park. I've camped there as a kid, so I know exactly where it is. Well, I don't know exactly where the tree is, but I know exactly where the location is. So.
Thank you, Tom. So yes, I believe Ag and Markets has been incredibly efficient the last 12 months with most of the data. But your question made me realize that the data, the spotted lanternfly data, is one of the species hidden on IMAP because of its economic ramifications, and we don't want any inaccurate reports visible at this time. So therefore, people who submit data can't actually see it. So even if this is confirmed and that record is confirmed, the submitter still won't see it. So I made a note here, and I'll bring it to Mitch's attention. I think it might be very helpful for our 2022 process to set up some kind of feedback so people know their record was confirmed or not confirmed, even though they can't view it.
Right. And one way is it's kind of a roundabout, kind of muddied way, but when you look at that SLF map that's produced by Northeast IPM, if all of a sudden your area is lighting up, and you submitted it for a new location for the county, it's likely that you were the one that did it. But we do have these set as confidential because there are regulatory and economic concerns. We wouldn't want a false report to negatively impact someone's business. We wouldn't want a positive, we would want to notify, other partners, whether it be USDA or our equivalent in other states. If, say, a county adjacent to Connecticut or a county adjacent to Vermont became positive, we would want to notify them that, hey, this was found. We would want to go through official channels to alert those other stakeholders rather than hear about it through, a newspaper article. It's just the proper way of doing things so that they're not overwhelmed with questions they're not prepared for.
Right.
So there's economic and other concerns why some of these pests like Asian longhorn beetle or spotted lanternfly are are set to confidential. And I have a feeling that as spotted lanternfly becomes more widespread, that will be those control. That will be less of a concern. It's pretty like for Staten Island. Everyone in Staten Island has a population of spotted lanternfly at this point. Every kilometer grid that we have surveyed has a positive. That unfortunate situation may spread to other parts of the state. So.
Right. All right. Well, with that, I'm gonna go to our thank you slide here. So, thank you to our presenters and to you guys, the audience, and the input and the questions. Again, our website is the iMapInvasives.org, and the special spotted lanternfly page has all of this there and more. And we will wrap up for the last one of 2021, and we will be sure to follow up with everyone in the new year. Thank you.